Imagine meeting the family of the person you love, expecting awkward small talk, polite dinners, and a few probing questions. Now imagine instead discovering a nightmare so deeply rooted in smiles and false warmth that it threatens not just your love, but your very life. This is the story of Get Out. On this spring day, Chris Washington, a young photographer, believed he was simply driving out of the city to meet his girlfriend Rose's parents. He had no idea that the trip would descend into a chilling nightmare, where freedom itself would slip through his fingers. Chris Washington sat in his apartment, camera gear scattered on the table, nervously scrolling through his phone. Rose, his girlfriend, reassured him with playful affection. They had been dating for months, and today was the big step, meeting her family. She insisted that her parents were progressive, kind, and open-minded. Chris believed her, but a knot twisted inside him, an instinct telling him that something about this weekend would be different.
The drive out to Rose's family estate started normally, music, laughter, and the soft hum of tires on pavement. But the roads soon narrowed into long stretches lined with trees, where the air grew heavier, the silence more profound. Chris's eyes wandered to the passing scenery, his thoughts dipping into unease. Then it happened. The sudden, brutal crash. A deer darted into the road and the car struck it with a sickening thud. Chris got out, staring at the dying animal as it gasped for air, its body twitching before falling still. Something about the moment chilled him. Not just the accident itself, but the eerie symbolism. The fragility of life, the way death had come out of nowhere, uninvited. Rose tried to pull him back, reminding him it wasn't his fault. But Chris's gaze lingered, unsettled. By the time they arrived at the Armitage estate, the unease had settled like a fog around him. The house was large, elegant, and seemingly welcoming, its white walls gleaming in the sunlight. Rose's parents, Dean and Missy Armitage, stepped out to greet them. Dean, a neurosurgeon, radiated cheerfulness, a little too much cheerfulness. Missy, a psychiatrist, carried herself with a poised calm that felt equally disarming. Dean's words were warm, but almost rehearsed. "I would have voted for Obama a third time if I could," he said, smiling wide, as though this line had been delivered many times before. Chris smiled politely, though his stomach turned. Inside, the warmth continued. Family photos on the walls, polished furniture, the scent of freshly cooked food. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. But then, Chris noticed them, the help. A groundskeeper named Walter and a housekeeper named Georgina. Both black, both dressed neatly, both speaking with an unsettling stiffness that didn't belong in the present day. Their smiles lingered too long, their eyes seemed distant, and every word they spoke carried an unnatural cadence. Chris felt an icy wave of discomfort. Something about Georgina and Walter was wrong. They looked like people, but their presence was like mannequins pretending to live. Missy insisted Chris join her for tea, her voice smooth, commanding. As the spoon clinked against the cup, her hypnotic rhythm began. Chris, reluctantly, allowed her to guide him into a trance. He thought it was harmless conversation, until suddenly, he couldn't move. His body sat frozen, while his mind was pulled down, into a dark, endless void. The sunken place. Chris was trapped, screaming soundlessly, his body above unresponsive, while Missy's calm face loomed over him. When he awoke later in bed, drenched in sweat, he wasn't sure if it had been a dream or something far more sinister, but he knew one thing. Something was deeply, horribly wrong in this house. Chris woke with a start the next morning, unsure whether the haunting hypnosis from Missy had been real or imagined. The house seemed normal in the daylight, the morning sun warming its walls. Rose greeted him with casual affection, as if nothing had happened, but Chris couldn't shake the suffocating memory of falling into that endless void. He tried to brush it off, telling himself maybe it was just nerves, but soon he realized he wouldn't get time to recover, because Rose's family was hosting a party that very day. Cars pulled up one by one, polished and expensive. Guests stepped out, dressed in elegant clothes, their smiles wide, their voices polite. At first, Chris thought it was just a typical wealthy suburban party. But quickly, His discomfort returned. The guests flocked to him, surrounding him with endless questions that felt less like curiosity and more like an examination. They complimented his physique, his skin, his strength. They spoke of golf, asking if he played. One woman even touched his arm without asking, feeling the muscle beneath. Their fascination wasn't admiration. It was something deeper, something predatory. Rose brushed it off, joking about how awkward her family's friends could be. But Chris felt it like barbed wire tightening around him. He was no longer a guest. He was merchandise, on display. Among the sea of strange faces, one stood out. A blind man named Jim Hudson, a former art dealer. Unlike the others, his questions weren't about Chris's body or his race. Instead, he spoke of Chris's photography. He admired his talent, even confessing jealousy for his artistic eye. For a moment, Chris felt a sliver of relief. Finally, someone who saw him as a person, not an object. But even that comfort carried a subtle unease. Why, he wondered, was everyone here so intensely focused on him? Then, the party shifted into terror. As Chris mingled, he spotted another black man among the guests. Logan. He dressed in old-fashioned clothing, spoke with stiff politeness, and clung to his much older white wife with strange dependence. His demeanor was eerily similar to Walter and Georgina, but Chris, ever the photographer, raised his camera to capture the moment. When the flash went off, everything changed. Logan froze. His smile cracked. His eyes widened in sudden terror, and he stumbled forward. Blood dripped from his nose as he grabbed Chris violently. "Get out! Get out!" he screamed, his voice raw with desperation. The room fell silent. The guests stared, shocked. Rose's family rushed in, quickly restraining Logan, calming the crowd, and brushing it off as a seizure. But Chris knew what he had seen. That was no seizure. That was a man breaking free, if only for a moment. Later, as Chris tried to steady himself, he went for a walk on the grounds with Rose, sharing his growing fears. Rose held him, promised him everything was fine, promised she loved him. She was his anchor, or so he believed. Meanwhile, back at the house, a quiet gathering had formed. Dean and Missy stood before the party guests, while Jim Hudson and others sat in anticipation. A large framed photograph of Chris was displayed on an easel. Dean raised his hands. The bidding began. Silent, cold, efficient. An auction, not for art, not for property, but for Chris. The reality struck like a blade. Chris was not a guest at this party. He was prey, chosen for something far more sinister than he could have imagined. Later that evening, Chris confided in Rose that he wanted to leave. He'd seen enough. The stares, the questions, Logan's outburst, none of it felt safe. Rose hesitated, but eventually agreed. They would pack their bags and leave in the morning. But before he could escape, another chilling moment unfolded. Chris encountered Georgina alone, and, with quiet politeness, he expressed how uncomfortable he felt in the house. He wanted her to know he understood. Georgina's smile faltered. For a moment, her eyes shimmered with sadness, then with terror. A single tear rolled down her face as she whispered, "No, no, 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 no." Her voice cracked, as if something inside her was trying desperately to break free, only to be pulled back into silence. Chris backed away, his heart pounding. Whatever was happening to Georgina and the others, it was worse than he could have imagined. That night, Chris sat in his room scrolling through photos on his phone. He zoomed in on Logan's face from earlier, studying the terror in his eyes during the flash. He knew now that something sinister was happening. He turned to Rose, telling her they needed to go immediately. And once again, she agreed, soothing his fear, holding his hand. But outside the bedroom door, footsteps creaked. The family was awake, watching, waiting. And though Chris didn't yet realize it, his time was running out. The night deepened. The party had ended, and silence blanketed the Armitage estate. But Chris couldn't sleep. His mind replayed Logan's sudden outburst, Georgina's tearful breakdown, and the auction-like gathering he hadn't fully understood. He made up his mind. He and Rose needed to leave immediately. Chris stuffed his belongings into a bag, his hands trembling as he texted his friend Rod for help. Rod, suspicious from the beginning, texted back quickly, urging Chris to get out now. Rod's paranoia suddenly seemed less like paranoia and more like truth. Chris turned to Rose, who sat on the bed, confused by his panic. She asked him to slow down, to explain what was wrong. He told her about Logan, about Georgina, about the way the guests looked at him like a possession. Rose hesitated, then nodded. Okay, let's go. Relief washed over him. Rose was his lifeline. They would escape together.
They made their way downstairs, Chris clutching his bag, Rose guiding him. But when they reached the front door, something was wrong. Dean and Jeremy stood there blocking the exit. Missy lurked behind them, calm as ever. Chris's heart pounded. He demanded Rose get the keys. She fumbled in her purse, searching, her hands trembling. Jeremy smirked, leaning lazily against the doorframe with a lacrosse stick in hand. "Rose, the keys!" Chris's voice broke with desperation. She kept digging, her voice soft. "I'm looking, babe, I'm looking." But deep down, Chris knew. Finally, Rose's hand stilled. She looked up at Chris with a calm, almost cruel smile. She pulled the keys from her purse, dangling them in the air. "You know I can't give you these, right?" The words hit like a knife. His world collapsed in an instant. Every moment of warmth, every kiss, every promise had been a lie. Rose wasn't his way out. She was part of the trap. Chris lunged for the door, but Missy spoke a single word. "Sink." Instantly, his body betrayed him. His limbs went limp, his vision blurred, and the floor seemed to open beneath him. He crashed once more into the darkness of the sunken place, screaming silently as his consciousness spiraled into a black void. When Chris awoke, he was strapped to a chair in a dimly lit basement. A television flickered in front of him, static humming in the background. The room felt like a surgical chamber, sterile and suffocating. The screen came to life, and Dean appeared in a recorded message, cheerfully explaining what was about to happen. He spoke of the coagula procedure, a twisted form of brain transplantation. Wealthy white patrons, desperate for youth, talent, or physical abilities, purchased black bodies to inhabit. The original consciousness would be forced into the sunken place, silenced forever. Chris trembled as the truth sank in. He hadn't been brought here as Rose's boyfriend. He'd been brought here as a vessel. The screen shifted, and Jim Hudson appeared, the blind art dealer. His voice was calm, almost reassuring. He explained that he had won Chris in the auction. Jim didn't care about race, he claimed. He only wanted Chris's eye, his artistic vision. Jim's body was failing, but with Chris's, he could see the world anew. It was all dressed in polite words, but the horror was clear. Chris's life was over. He would be nothing but a prisoner inside his own body. As Jim's message ended, the static returned. Chris sat in silence, his heart hammering. His fate seemed sealed. But then, his eyes fell on the armchair beneath him. The fabric was frayed, tufts of cotton stuffing poking out. Instinct took over. Slowly, carefully, Chris began scraping at the fabric with his fingers, pulling the cotton free. He stuffed it into his ears, layer by layer, until the sound from the TV dulled to silence. When Missy triggered the hypnosis again, her spoon clinking against the teacup, Chris's body stayed strong. He pretended to collapse, but this time, he was still in control. Chris waited. He knew the surgery would begin soon. He knew they would come for him. But this time, he would be ready. The basement clock ticked quietly, each second stretching like an eternity. Chris sat slumped in the chair, appearing unconscious. The cotton stuffed deep in his ears shielded him from the hypnotic triggers. He was awake. He was waiting. Upstairs, Dean prepared the operating room. Bright surgical lights buzzed overhead, sterile instruments neatly lined on trays. The family moved with practiced calm. This was not their first victim. Jeremy wheeled in Jim Hudson, who sat patiently, his frail frame dwarfed by the sterile gown. His face carried an eager serenity, like a man waiting for a rebirth. Dean assured him the procedure would be swift. Downstairs, the TV flickered on again, playing Missy's swirling patterns, meant to drag Chris back into the sunken place. But Chris didn't move. His head drooped, his breathing shallow, convincing them he was under. Jeremy entered the basement, whistling softly as he approached Chris's limp body. He unlocked the restraints, ready to transfer him to the operating table. But in a sudden blur of motion, Chris exploded upward. With the metal ball from the armchair clutched in his fist, he swung with all his strength, striking Jeremy across the skull. Blood sprayed as Jeremy crumpled. Chris grabbed the antlered deer head mounted on the wall, a grotesque trophy, and ripped it free. The wooden base became a weapon in his hands. Chris stormed upstairs. Dean, hearing the noise, rushed down the hallway. Before he could react, Chris rammed the antlers into Dean's chest, impaling him. Dean gasped, collapsing as blood soaked his shirt. Missy appeared next, calm even in chaos, clutching her teacup. She raised the spoon, prepared to trap him again. But Chris lunged forward, knocking the cup from her hands. In the struggle, he grabbed a letter opener from her desk and stabbed her through the throat. Her eyes widened with shock as she crumpled to the floor, her blood spreading across the rug. Chris staggered toward the front door, his body shaking from adrenaline. But suddenly, Jeremy leapt from the side, blood still running down his face. He tackled Chris, locking him in a chokehold. The two wrestled violently, crashing into furniture. Jeremy's strength was fueled by rage, but Chris fought with desperation. Using his wits, he jammed his fingers deep into Jeremy's bloody wound, forcing him to scream. Then, Chris grabbed a knife from the floor and drove it into Jeremy's leg, before finishing him with a savage stomp to the head. Jeremy lay motionless, his skull cracked against the hardwood floor. Chris staggered out the front door, finally free of the house, but the nightmare wasn't over. Rose appeared on the porch, calm and smiling, holding a hunting rifle. She called out softly, her voice sweet, almost mocking. "You know I loved you, right?" Behind her, Georgina appeared, carrying tea. Her eyes were hollow, her movements mechanical. But Chris saw something else, a flicker of consciousness trapped deep inside her. Chris tried to save her, pulling her into the car as he fled. But Georgina panicked. The real woman inside her body, Rose's grandmother, erupted in fury. She clawed at Chris, causing the car to swerve violently before crashing. Georgina was thrown forward, her body lifeless. Chris stumbled out of the wreck, bloodied but alive. Rose was waiting, rifle aimed. At her side was Walter, the groundskeeper, who sprinted toward Chris like a predator. In a desperate move, Chris raised his phone, the camera flash bursting across the night. Walter froze. His body shook violently as the flash jolted the real man, Logan, to the surface. His eyes cleared, his voice trembling. He turned to Rose. "Let me do it, babe. Let me finish him." Rose handed Walter the rifle. He lifted it, pointing it at Chris. But then, with a sudden twist, he turned the barrel on himself. The shot rang out and Walter collapsed, finally free of the body that had imprisoned him. Chris limped toward Rose. She lay on the ground now, screaming and begging. Her sweet tone had vanished, replaced by venom. She reached for the rifle, but Chris kicked it away. He knelt over her, his hands tightening around her throat. She gasped, smiling even as her life slipped away, whispering, "I knew you were special." But Chris stopped. His hands shook. He couldn't become like them. He released her, letting her gasp for air. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed across the night. A police car pulled up. Chris froze, his body rigid with terror. He imagined the headlines: a black man standing over a wounded white woman, surrounded by bodies. Rose smiled through her blood, whispering, "You're screwed." But as the car door opened, Chris's heart surged with relief. It wasn't the police, it was Rod. Rod stepped out, arms crossed, staring at the carnage. "Man, I told you not to go up in that house." Chris collapsed into the car. No words were needed. As they drove away, the Armitage estate disappeared into the night, its dark secrets buried, but never gone. Chris survived, but the scars of what he endured, the betrayal of Rose, the horror of the sunken place, and the exploitation of his very identity, would never leave him. The Armitage family was destroyed, but their twisted practices exposed a nightmare hiding behind smiles and politeness. For Chris, survival was victory, but freedom came at a cost. If this story shook you, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest tales from horror cinema and real life.